A bone fragment sits in a clean room in Leipzig. It is roughly the size of a thumb, porous, stained the color of wet clay. A technician in nitrile gloves places it into a UV sterilized tray and begins drilling. The powder that falls from this fragment, less than 50 milligrams, contains a genetic autobiography that stretches back thousands of years. And it was pulled from a grave in Saxony-Anhalt, a region of eastern Germany so dense with ancient burial sites that archaeologists have sampled skeletons buried less than a meter apart who turned out to be separated by 40 centuries. That detail is the key to everything that follows. Because no population in Europe has been overwritten, erased, and rebuilt as many times as the people living in what we now call Germany. 5 times, in fact. 5 full-scale genetic replacements in a single geographic corridor, each one so thorough that the people living after it bore almost no resemblance to the people living before. No other region on the continent comes close. And the strangest part is not that it happened. It is that the evidence was sitting in museum drawers for decades before anyone understood what it meant. To see why, you have to start at the beginning. Not the beginning of Germany. The beginning of humans in Germany. Around 45,000 years ago, the first modern humans pushed into Central Europe. They were hunter-gatherers, small bands moving through forests that bordered retreating glaciers. They carried something with them that would become invisible for millennia, between 3 to 6% Neanderthal DNA, woven into their genomes through interbreeding that had occurred generations earlier, probably in the Middle East. These people hunted mammoth and reindeer across tundra that covered most of what is now northern Germany. They carved figurines from ivory. They survived conditions that would break a modern expedition. For a long time, researchers assumed these earliest Europeans were the direct ancestors of everyone who came after. That assumption felt reasonable. The archaeological record showed continuous habitation. Tools evolved in place. Burial practices shifted gradually. Why would the people not be continuous too? They were not. A 2016 study led by David Reich at Harvard and Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute changed the picture completely. Their team analyzed genome-wide data from 51 ancient individuals spanning 38,000 years of European prehistory using a technique called in-solution hybrid capture enrichment. They baited ancient DNA fragments with 1.2 million synthetic probe sequences, then filtered for damage patterns, specifically cytosine to uracil errors at the ends of molecules that only appear in genuinely ancient DNA. Modern contamination from archaeologists and lab workers was stripped away. What remained was the real signal, and it told a story nobody expected. The results dismantled the continuity model entirely. Between 37,000 and 14,000 years ago, every human in Europe descended from a single founding population. But that founding population was not the first people to arrive. The earliest humans on the continent left no detectable genetic trace in anyone alive today. They were replaced completely by a later group. And then that group was displaced too. A 35,000-year-old individual from northwestern Europe turned out to represent an early branch of this founder lineage. His genetic signature disappeared from the region entirely, only to resurface 19,000 years later in southwestern Europe, at the height of the Ice Age, when glaciers covered everything north of the Alps and the habitable zone shrank to a narrow strip along the Mediterranean coast. When the ice finally retreated, around 14,000 years ago, a new genetic component appeared, one related to present-day Near Easterners, and it spread across the continent rapidly, displacing the southwestern group that had only just recolonized the north. David Reich put it plainly. Trying to represent this vast period with only 4 ancient genomes, which was all anyone had before, was like trying to summarize a movie with 4 still images. With 51 samples, the narrative arc became visible. And what it showed was a population history no less complicated than the last 7,000 years, with multiple episodes of replacement and immigration on a vast scale, driven by a climate that swung between extremes. 2 full population turnovers before agriculture even existed. And here is the detail that pins it to Germany specifically. The Neanderthal DNA carried by those first arrivals started at 3 to 6%. Today, most Europeans carry about 2%. That decline was not random drift. Natural selection actively purged Neanderthal variants over thousands of years. Reich described them as slightly toxic to modern humans, and the rate at which they disappeared gives geneticists a molecular clock for tracking how fast these early populations were being replaced. In Germany, the decline tracks almost perfectly with each successive population turnover. Then came the event that rewired everything. Around 7,500 years ago, a wave of farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, began moving into Central Europe along the Danube and its tributaries. They brought emmer wheat, barley, cattle, pigs, sheep, and a completely new way of living. In Germany, they became the linear band ceramic culture, or LBK, named for the incised linear patterns on their pottery. Genome-wide analysis of 32 individuals from the LBK site at Derenberg-Mierensteig in central Germany, published by a team at the Max Planck Institute, showed that these people carried predominantly Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, with barely any contribution from local hunter-gatherers. They were not locals who learned to farm. They were migrants who brought farming with them. What makes the LBK remarkable is not just the replacement, it is the uniformity. Wolfgang Hock at the University of Adelaide demonstrated that farmers from Hungary, Germany, and Spain were genetically almost identical. They came from the same source. The LBK spread from the Carpathian Basin to the Paris Basin in just a few centuries, becoming what Alan Cooper called the first pan-European culture. Their genetic signature swamped the indigenous hunter-gatherers of Central Europe. But something curious happened in Germany that did not happen quite the same way elsewhere. By the late Neolithic, about 1,000 years after the LBK arrived, hunter-gatherer ancestry in German farming populations had climbed back to around 25%. In Hungary, it was only 10%. In parts of Iberia, it reached 50%. Germany sat in the geographic middle, a crossroads as always. What makes this strange is the way the recovery happened. Research on selection signatures in the LBK cohort, published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, showed that genes related to immune function and metabolic adaptation were under strong positive selection in these early farming populations. The hunter-gatherer alleles that resurfaced were not random survivors. They were functional adaptations, cold tolerance, disease resistance, dietary flexibility, that continued providing advantages long after the people who first carried them had been outnumbered and absorbed. Natural selection does not care about cultural identity. It keeps what works. And then, around 4000 BCE, something destabilized the system. Haplogroup H, the mitochondrial lineage carried by the LBK and their descendants, suddenly became rare. New variants appeared, carried by populations whose origins could not be traced. Peter Bogocki at Princeton noted that long houses disappeared, settlement patterns changed, stone tools shifted. The entire agricultural system that had sustained Central Europe for 1,500 years ran its course, and something caused it to break. Nobody fully knows what. Then the Steppe came. Around 4,500 years ago, pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, began pushing westward into Europe. These were the people associated with the Yamnaya culture, and their genetic fingerprint was unlike anything the continent had seen. They carried roughly equal parts Eastern European hunter-gatherer and Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, a combination that had never appeared in Europe before. They herded cattle and sheep, buried their dead under earthen mounds called kurgans, and may have spoken the ancestor of most modern European languages. When the corded Ware culture appeared in Germany around 2500 BCE, the genetic data were staggering. A 2015 study by Haak, Lazaridis, and Reich found that approximately 75% of corded Ware ancestry in Germany came from Yamnaya-related populations. Not a gradual blending over centuries. A massive, rapid replacement. The genetic distance between Middle Neolithic Germans and corded Ware Germans was larger than the distance between the corded Ware and the Yamnaya themselves, who had lived 2,600 kilometers to the east. If continuous gene flow from the steppe had been occurring over generations, you would expect each successive culture in Germany to drift slowly eastward on a genetic plot. Instead, the corded Ware appeared fully formed, as if a population had transplanted itself wholesale. The migration was heavily male-biased. X-chromosome analysis confirmed that steppe ancestry entered through more male than female ancestors, meaning incoming men were pairing with local Neolithic women while local male lineages disappeared. The Y-chromosome haplogroup R1b, now dominant in German men, traces directly to these steppe arrivals. Christian Christiansen at the University of Gothenburg went further, suggesting the evidence pointed to a kind of genocide, a sharp upsurge in lethal violence coinciding with the appearance of steppe-related peoples and the vanishing of earlier male lineages. Not everyone agrees with that framing. Some archaeologists argue the process was more complex, that the corded Ware was a polyethnic society from its inception, a cultural fusion rather than a military conquest. A 2021 study from Bohemia suggested that the early corded Ware combined people of the globular amphora culture with Yamnaya-related migrants who carried different DNA, different material culture, and probably spoke different languages. The 75% figure measures ancestry contribution. It does not, by itself, prove the mechanism. What it does prove is the scale. But here is where the German story fractures from the rest of Europe. In Switzerland, researchers analyzing 96 ancient genomes found that steppe ancestry arrived by 2860 BCE to 2460 BCE, possibly earlier than in some parts of Germany itself. And buried at sites in the same region, they found women without any detectable steppe ancestry dating to as late as 2213 BCE. That is a gap of over 600 years where people with and without steppe DNA were buried in the same valleys. Parallel societies, for centuries. The genetic data do not tell us whether this was peaceful coexistence, economic stratification, or something else entirely. But they rule out the clean narrative of a single invasion followed by total replacement. The actual process was messier, longer, and far more socially structured than anyone assumed. For roughly 2,000 years after the corded Ware expansion, the genetic landscape of Central Europe appeared remarkably stable. Bronze Age, Iron Age, even the Roman period, none left a dramatic genetic signature in the German heartland. The Roman Empire, despite governing much of Western and Southern Germany for centuries, did not measurably alter the population's DNA. Empires, it turns out, can control territory without replacing people. What did reshape Germany came from two directions, and both were invisible to every analytical method available before 2025. In January of that year, researchers at the Francis Crick Institute published a study introducing twig stats, a new way of reading genetic family trees. Traditional F statistics could distinguish between very different populations, hunter-gatherers versus farmers, for instance, but they broke down when populations were closely related, which is exactly the situation across most of first millennium Europe. Everyone was some mix of farmer and steppe ancestry. The differences between groups were real but subtle, and older tools simply could not resolve them. TwigStats solved this by focusing on the most recent branches of genealogical trees, filtering out ancient noise, and achieving 10 times the statistical power of previous methods. Leo Speidel, the study's lead author at the Crick Institute, described it as finally being able to see what had been invisible: migrations all across Europe that older tools lacked the resolution to detect. Applied to over 1,500 ancient genomes from the first millennium, TwigStats revealed what historians had debated for generations, but could never prove genetically: multiple waves of Germanic-speaking peoples migrating southward from northern Germany and Scandinavia during the early centuries of the Common Era. Their ancestry appeared in individuals from southern Germany, Italy, Poland, Slovakia, and southern Britain. One individual in southern Europe carried 100% Scandinavian-like ancestry. A person buried in 2nd to 4th century York, possibly a Roman soldier or slave gladiator, carried 25% early Iron Age Scandinavian DNA, centuries before the Anglo-Saxon migrations even began. If you want to see how each of these genetic layers plays out in other parts of Europe, and there are some extraordinary parallels, this is the kind of deep dive we do regularly on this channel. Subscribing is the simplest way to catch them when they drop. The two main zones of Germanic migration matched the three branches of Germanic languages. One stayed in Scandinavia, one spread south and eventually went extinct, and one formed the basis of modern German and English. The genetics were not just confirming what Tacitus wrote in 98 CE. They were revealing movements that Tacitus, with all his informants, never knew about. Then came a reverse flow nobody anticipated. Between 300 and 800 CE, ancestry from Central Europe migrated back northward into Scandinavia. People buried on the Swedish island of Åland carried Central European DNA, but had grown up locally, based on isotope analysis of their teeth. This was not a single event, but a sustained shift in ancestry, and it happened in the centuries just before the Viking-Age exploded outward. The implication is uncomfortable, but hard to avoid. Some of the genetic diversity that fueled the Viking expansion may have originated in the very regions that Germanic peoples had left centuries earlier. History folding back on itself. A genetic boomerang arcing across 1,000 kilometers and half a dozen centuries. And then came the final overwrite. In September 2025, a study led by Joscha Gretzinger at the Max Planck Institute sequenced 555 ancient individuals from Slavic period contexts across Central and Eastern Europe. The findings were stark. During the 6th to 8th centuries, populations migrating from Eastern Europe replaced more than 80% of the local gene pool in Eastern Germany. 80%. In 200 years. The incoming populations traced their origins to the region between the Dniester and Don rivers, southern Belarus to central Ukraine. Unlike the steppe migration 3,000 years earlier, this one showed no significant sex bias. Entire families moved together, forming communities organized around large patrilineal clans. In Eastern Germany, the transformation was the most dramatic anywhere on the continent. Following the collapse of the Thuringian kingdom in the 6th century, the region was resettled almost entirely by newcomers from the east. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. The earlier population's burial practices, pottery traditions, and settlement patterns simply vanish from the record and are replaced by something wholly different. The people who had lived there before, descendants of populations with strong genetic ties to Northern Europe and Scandinavia, effectively disappeared, not through a single catastrophic event, but through a sustained wave of settlement that lasted 2 centuries. Gretzinger's team found multi-generational pedigrees at several sites, revealing extended family networks that organized these new communities. Women of marriageable age typically moved between villages, while patrilineal descent structured inheritance and social position. And here is what no one predicted. Those medieval Slavic settlers left a genetic signature that persists in Eastern Germany today. The Sorbs, a Slavic-speaking minority of around 60,000 people living in Saxony and Brandenburg, retain a genetic profile closely matching the early medieval populations from over 1,000 years ago. Despite centuries of surrounding cultural and linguistic change, despite Germanization campaigns, wars, border shifts, and industrial transformation, their DNA has barely moved. Johannes Krauss called the Slavic expansion likely the last demographic event of continental scale to permanently reshape the genetic and linguistic landscape of Europe. 5 replacements. 5 near-total rewrites of the same geographic territory. Ice Age hunter-gatherers displaced by a founder population. That population disrupted by a post-glacial Near Eastern influx. Then Anatolian farmers sweeping out the old order. Then steppe herders rewriting 75% of the genome. Then Slavic migrants erasing 80% of the gene pool in the East. What makes German DNA the strangest in Europe is not any single one of these events. Other countries experienced 1 or 2 of them. Germany experienced all of them, layered on top of each other in the same river valleys, the same Loess plains, the same burial grounds. The result is a population whose genome reads less like a family tree and more like a geological core sample, layer after layer, each one nearly obliterating the one beneath it, each one leaving just enough trace to prove it was there. And scientists are still drilling. TwigStats is barely a year old. The Slavic study was published last autumn. The sampling transect through Saxony-Anhalt keeps producing new sequences. Somewhere in a clean room right now, in Leipzig or Jena or Tübingen, there is a bone fragment that has not been touched yet. When it is, when that 50 milligrams of powder yields its data, it will almost certainly complicate the story again. Because 5 layers is what we can see with the tools we have now. Nobody is betting that there are only 5.